came up this morning.
Monday.
Yeah.
With attitude like not believing in karma, not knowing it's true or not true,
Yeah.
because not seeing the proof,
Yeah.
but a person with loving kindness
Yeah.
do good deed, does it qualify as a not having right will or having a wrong will already?
No, it would qualify as not having right view, but not having wrong view.
Okay, but if a person rejects that it's not possible, there's karma, but is still doing good deed, then
Yeah.
it's a good will but good intention.
Say again.
A person rejects the idea there is a law of karma, but naturally the person is very generous and doing good deed,
Yeah.
and that qualify as a right will, as a wrong will, I mean.
I'd say that if they reject the principle of karma and say definitely there's no such thing as karma, that is a wrong view. But insofar as they're doing good deeds, practicing generosity and observing a moral life, that is wholesome. And so they're generating wholesome, even though they don't believe in karma, but they're creating wholesome karma through their actions.
Thank you.
But I have to say, I think I said this in the last class or several classes before that. In the Buddha's time, if anybody rejects continuation beyond death, survival of death in some form, and rejects the working of the law of karma, it immediately sort of arouses the suspicion that they're the type of person that engages in unwholesome actions. Whereas today, because of the predominance of the so-called scientific worldview, there are many people who are with critical intelligence who will reject survival beyond death and the working of a law of karma and come to the conclusion that this is the only life that we live, that life and consciousness emerged out of configurations of matter, and yet through their own natural character and reflection, they lead moral, ethical life. And so I don't think that their rejection of the survival beyond death and the law of karma counts as in the same category as the rejection of those ideas by a thinker in the times of the Buddha. Because the whole culture is very different. Culture, the worldview, the dominant worldviews are very different. I mean, now even we have some of the most prominent Buddhist teachers today. What is that?
I read one article by Gil Fronsdale.
Yeah, Gil Fronsdale is. He says.
He doesn't have to believe in
Yeah, I've seen that too. Yeah. Whether one, I think it's up to a person to consider, to decide for themselves whether they want to consider themselves Buddhist. But other people will look and say, if you don't accept this or that, then you're not a Buddhist. But as long, I would say as long as they look to the Buddha for guidance and base their understanding and practice to some extent on the Buddha's teachings, they could consider themselves Buddhist. Though I'd have to say that their view and understanding is defective in that respect. Is this your first time here? Mm-hmm. What is your name? Patrick. So welcome to our class. Did anybody on the internet have any questions? Sukhi, okay. I'm not sure that's on. Okay.
Bhante, the consciousness in the field of karma, is consciousness, does it have a ethical quality in there, wholesome and unwholesome quality, consciousness part?
In the results of karma?
No, consciousness itself.
In what?
Does it have a
consciousness itself? Does it have an ethical quality?
Right.
I think one could answer that from different points of view. Insofar as one just considers consciousness purely in itself, taken in isolation from all of the associated mental factors, then it seems that consciousness doesn't have its own ethical quality, since consciousness is just the awareness occurring through any of the sense bases. But often in the Buddhist text, they distinguish different states of consciousness by way of the associated mental qualities. And in that case, consciousness then takes on the ethical quality of its associated mental factors. So if the volition is wholesome, if the state of consciousness is associated with non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, then we would say that the state of consciousness is wholesome. If the volition is harmful and the consciousness is associated with greed, hatred, delusion, or any of the other defilements, then one would say that the consciousness is unwholesome. So that's like in the Abhidhamma system, that's why they distinguish kusala citta, akusala citta, wholesome states of consciousness, unwholesome states of consciousness.
But you never say kusala vijnana, akusala vijnana, right?
I don't think I've seen that. It's always, because when the word vijnana is used, it seems to be always referring to consciousness in its role of pure, bare sensory awareness. And when they want to indicate consciousness in association with its factors, the consciousness as a composite whole, then the word citta will be used.
And citta will already go into karma for the next bhava, right?
There are many different classifications of citta. So if you take the Abhidhamma system, then you have vipaka citta. This is resultant consciousness, or resultant states of consciousness. And those are not wholesome, not unwholesome, because they're the result of karma. And then the purely functional states of consciousness, also not wholesome, not unwholesome.
Right. Thank you.
I think the Buddha's teaching, in the suttas, always has a kind of pragmatic or practical orientation. And so one doesn't find such elaborate classifications and systematization of consciousness in the suttas that you find in later, more theoretical works like the Abhidhamma. See you.
Sorry to kind of switch the topic. So today, you were talking about sensual kama bhava, sensual existence.
Yeah.
So it appears to me, Bhante, like if you, being a householder, if you really want to, at a mental level, give up the desire for sensual things, you'll end up as a monk or a nun. It's not easy.
Yeah, it is difficult. Yeah, even if you're a monk or a nun, it's not easy. But I mean, you have fewer distractions, but it's still, there's always the inward struggle. But there are lay people who do lead very earnest, contemplative lives. They have to be in a certain degree of fortune, not to have to be plunged constantly into this day-to-day struggle for life.
So also it feels like, so if you go to a forest,
yeah,
and you could actually get away from this sensuality, but is that an escape? Is it really you've gone beyond sensuality?
Simply by going to a forest, you don't get beyond sensuality. In the forest, there are fewer sensual distractions, but there's a sutta that goes, it is not the pretty things, it's not the pretty sense objects in the world that are a person's sensuality, it's sensual intention that's a person's sensuality. So you go into the forest, so there are fewer sensual distractions, but you still come up with the sensual desire in the mind, and the mind can conjure up countless diversified sensual fantasies. So it's a stepping stone to go into the forest, but it's not a complete solution in itself. Otherwise, everybody who goes into the forest, even people who go to national parks and go on tours, would be free from sensuality, at least for the extent of the tour. Okay, Richard, please take the microphone.
I know this is a bit out of the blue, but I was wondering, particularly after the Black Death in around 1349, there were a lot of groups of flagellants that went around, chopping themselves up, in effect, in Europe, particularly around Central Europe. And there were groups that flagellated themselves twice a day and once every night, right, and so on. I'm wondering, that of course is much closer to a lot of practices in Hinduism than in Buddhism, but is there any, were there any Buddhist sects that have practiced anything like that? Secondly, I noticed that the Bogomils had a practice that was rather like the Jain practice of starving oneself to death. And they were doing that about the same time, well, in the 1300s and so on. The Bogomils, also known as the Cathars.
Oh, I heard about
the Bulgari,
yeah.
Right? But they would get advanced to a certain extent, and then the Jains, who had like 31 orders of difficulty, right? They'd end up starving themselves to death. Have there ever been any? I mean, I know that there are Jain sects, and that a lot of Hindus consider Jains and Buddhists really to be Hindu in some way, which is kind of an upper class caste habit of co-opting other groups, right? But have there ever been any Buddhist groups that practiced anything like either of those, flagellation or starving oneself?
Flagellation, I think not at all. Okay.
There
could have been Buddhists sects that observe, maybe in Japan, that have observed some rather extreme ascetic practices.
Yeah.
I mean, the Buddha did allow certain ascetic practices, which are called dhutangas, as a way of disciplining oneself and developing qualities like simplicity and contentment. For example, making a determination to live only in the forest, not to stay in city and town temples, to live at the foot of a tree, to use food, only food received on alms round, not to accept offerings of meals. But there would be no orthodox sect of Buddhism that actually adopts these types of self-mortification. Of course, they would then be falling into one of the two extremes that the Buddha rejected. Right. But there seems to be one sort of natural disposition of the human mind is to make things difficult for oneself. And it could be that there were some Buddhist sects, I think maybe if anybody knows Japanese Buddhism better than I do, some sects in Japan that adopted very, very rigorous and demanding ascetic practices.
Yeah.
I think it could have been a branch of the Tendai sect or the Shingon sect. But I don't know enough about them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else?
Just wanted to say thanks for having me. I missed the session this morning, and my father's ashes are entombed up the hill here, so I just stopped by. I've got two questions. Since you talked about sensuality, which is something I could have used, but since you talked about sensuality this morning, so this is a question. I've got two questions, both concerning practice. The first is, when one practices, or at least tries to practice in a more serious way for a period of time, and you're invariably pulled back into society, unless you're a monk or a nun. What is, I guess the question is, how do you try, is there value to that practice? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to, which is that, to
the practice that one undertakes in seclusion.
No, what I mean is, if one goes out and you try really hard for a period of time, but then you're pulled back to regular society again. Is there, and let's say you never go back to practicing in that fashion, in that rigorous, intense fashion again. Was there value to that practice?
I say that there's still a value to that practice, even though you might not go back into intensive practice in that mode, but one should still continue to maintain some kind of daily practice, and then that period of more intense practice will give a boost to one's day-to-day practice. So if one completely discards all meditation practice after leaving the intense retreat and just goes back and leads an ordinary worldly way of life, then the value of that period of intense practice will be rather minimal, though it might remain somewhat as an impression in the mind, so that at some later time, if not in this existence, then in some future existence, it will contribute to bring together the conditions that will draw one back into the practice.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
My second question is about the four sublime attitudes.
Okay.
And so that was a practice that was interesting. However, I've heard that when one, at least as a beginner, starts out with the practice, when you're trying to send out or when you're trying to practice some of these things, irrespective of which one you're practicing, you don't actually, I've heard, I don't know, I'm just trying to confirm whether or not this is true. I've heard that you don't actually have any power at all when you're doing it. In other words, when you're trying to send out, let's say something like metta, for instance, or upekkha, it doesn't matter which one it is, then you're trying to cultivate it, but you're not actually sending out any power because you don't have any power. Or is that not true? Or is it true? Or is it the opposite, which is that there is power simply by invoking that thought? And
you mean you don't have power to
send,
say, to affect the content of the wish? So, to take a hypothetical example, you send compassion to somebody who is ill, thinking that by doing so you're going to cure them of their illness. Is that what you mean by sending out power?
Yeah, okay, so let's take karuna, right? And your example is an extreme example. I don't think that one has that kind of power, because one is not Guanyin Pusa. But is there a power at all to trying to send out, whether it's metta or karuna or whatever? Your example is right, though. It's more an extreme, but yes,
yeah,
that's
I'm not quite
correct.
sure what you mean by sending out power. A healing energy. Is that what you?
Or just sending out compassion or sending out metta. The idea that that one has the ability simply by invoking compassion or something that somehow gives true, I guess power is, maybe it's not the right word, maybe being able to affect change.
That's a good way to put it. First, what's said in the text, the texts don't speak about, don't say anything about that. Though what they say is that for one who abides constantly in loving kindness, that they become, actually there is maybe something like this. One becomes dear to human beings, dear to non-human beings. This is to beings beyond the human realm. The devas, the deities, protect one. And this is a little hard to believe, that weapons, fire, poison won't harm one. Yeah, so these are supposed to be some of the benefits of loving kindness. This is for one who develops what's called the metta ceto vimutti, the liberation of mind through loving kindness, which would be the meditative power equivalent to the jhanas through loving kindness. Yeah, so it's supposed to have those are supposed to be some of the powers that come from developing loving kindness.
Is that binary in a sense? Is that a 0 or 1, meaning that you get to a certain point and you get that, or do you simply practice and you get some benefit of that regardless of your level?
No, I think certainly the things like where it said that fire, poison, and weapons won't injure one, for that I think one has to be at the level of the jhanic attainment. Mm-hmm. The others, I would say they would probably work to some extent even at lower levels of practice. Just you could see, even in one's interactions with human beings, somebody who develops loving kindness and compassion, even if they don't advertise the fact, but just their presence will convey a kindly, compassionate vibes, so to speak, good vibes, so people will be naturally drawn towards them and want to associate with them. And so we can suppose that there will be devas and other invisible beings that also feel the pull of a person who develops those qualities.
You answered the question in terms of having devas or other beings help while you have this state. Or the jhana. Yeah. So are you saying that basically it's not coming from oneself, it's coming from an external force?
Well, one has to develop the quality oneself And by developing the quality oneself, it somehow impinges on the minds of other beings so that they feel the impact of they feel an impact from one's practice, and then they respond accordingly to come to one's assistance.
So it is an external force then?
Yeah.
Not an internal one. It has to, of course, come from the internal to the external.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Richard, and then Mano first, then Richard.
Bhante, you spoke a bit about cosmology in general and formless realms. Just being honest, it's one of the hard areas for me to get my head around, and especially the concept of eons and time and so forth, and maybe it's the same for some others as well. But where would you rank Buddhist cosmology in the overall importance of understanding Buddhism? If, hypothetically speaking, cosmology doesn't necessarily resonate, does that make you not a true Buddhist per se? Is it important for you to agree with the cosmology for you to be able to say that you're a good Buddhist?
I don't know. I don't think one has to agree with the cosmology in all respects to say that one is a good Buddhist. But the basic contours of the cosmology, though maybe not all the details, seem to me quite convincing. The idea that there is boundless dimensions of boundless extent of time, that world systems arise, unfold, disintegrate and perish, replaced by new world systems arising out of the dust of the old ones, and that within many of these world systems, intelligent forms of life will emerge. Perhaps something like that might occur even on this planet one day. You can't be sure. So that seems cogent to me. Whether there is a Tavatingsa Deva world presided over by Shaka, who is the king of the gods, the Yama Deva world presided over by King Suyama. I think you could be a perfectly good Buddhist without believing in that. These, we could say, are parts of the ancient Indian worldview or of culture that Buddhism took over.
Yeah, it does seem as though some aspect of the cosmology is to detract others who are believing in some of the other sects versus it being an important part of Buddhism. So in other words, trying to get people to not just focus on the jhanas, and so mentioning details about the formless realms and why that doesn't necessarily lead to final Nibbana was important. Thank you.
Okay, I think Richard had his hand.
Before the Buddha was enlightened, he spent time starving himself, right, eating 1 grain of rice a day and all of that, and so that he could touch his spine from the front. Now, he did not encourage anybody to do anything like that, and was saying, well, that's much too ascetic. But that's not the same thing as saying that it wasn't valuable for him, because for him to be the Tathagata and to find his way on his own, that may well have been necessary. He had to know that wasn't the way. For instance, his original friends in this venture, they thought it was. And so I'm wondering, did he ever talk about that? About the value of having at one point restricted himself that much? This is something which is attributed to him in biographies and such, right? But was it something he ever talked about?
about the value of those practices.
Yeah,
in
for
his
him,
own-
for his finding his way the first time, right?
No, I don't think so. I can't think of passages that could be construed in that way.
Oh.
It seems whenever he spoke about those practices, it was just to reject them as being not the efficient way to reach liberation.
But then also, that is, certainly these stories were circulating all the time that he'd done this.
Oh yeah,
on his way to enlightenment.
It seems
And
reasonable.
so, did other people regard that as part of his authority, saying, "Well, he knows what he's talking about. Look what he did."
I think that's maybe this looked at from one angle. That could be the reason why he had to undertake those practices in
Yeah.
order to be able to point that out and say that this is a dead end, that that this is practices won't lead to enlightenment, because one of the dominant views during this period was that the way to liberation is through extreme self-mortification.
Do you know if this had anything to do with his relationship with Mahavira? Because the Jains did end up starving themselves, and so he knew that, well, okay, another day or two of this and I'm dead. And he said,
he
well,
could
I'm
have
not more enlightened.
He could have taken up, even though the texts don't ever portray the Buddha as being a follower of the Jains.
Yeah.
But it could be that he No, I think it's more likely that simply that those practices were current during that age.
Yeah.
And so Mahavira took them up and adopted them, whereas the Buddha took them up, pursued them very rigorously, and then rejected them.
Yeah.
I don't think that there would have been a direct influence from Mahavira to Gautama the Buddha.
Well, but I mean, presumably when he was doing it, he would have been doing it thinking, well, this is a way to enlightenment.
That's
right?
what he would have.
And so, is there any hint about the source of that belief?
Nothing. It doesn't come to mind. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
It's just the way the texts portray it. After he left his earlier meditation teachers, then he just started taking up these rigorous ascetic practices. And the ones that are emphasized are more, not so much the starving, the long fasts, but extremely painful methods of meditation. This is in Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 36, the larger discourse to Saccaka.
Okay, right. Yeah. Okay.
They call it the non-breathing meditation, whereby he holds his breath, trying to stifle the breath, and it leads to excruciating pains throughout the body. And he strengthens his will to endure those pains without submitting to them. Okay, I think we can call it a day. Okay, so let us end with the 3 half bows, the Buddha.